Too often the coach battery is kind of like that spare tire, right? It's tucked away, it's out of sight, and it's out of mind until something goes sideways. It might be the single most important piece of gear in your entire RV. Think about it. Every single critical system in your RV operates off of the 12-volt DC system. And most people don't give the battery even a single thought when they're buying a new or used RV because it's not shiny, it doesn't have a touchscreen. Well, actually, some of them do, and it most certainly doesn't come with mood lighting. During setup, it's somewhere between I'll deal with that later and wait a minute, there's a battery in this thing? And then maintenance? Yeah, well, that's usually an afterthought until something goes sideways because, well, your battery, again, is out of juice. Today, we're talking about batteries in your RV. It's one of the most common questions that not only do I hear, but I see on Facebook forums, and that is how many batteries or how big of a battery do I need in my RV? And a lot of times that question is asked only after we've run into some kind of problems, like your overhead fan that you're using to bring in fresh air into your RV sucks down all the battery juice out there when you're boondocking, and now you can't get your landing gear up and you can't get your slides in because you're just simply out of juice because you didn't have a big enough battery setup. And so for those of you who have been around the YouTube world for a while, you know that we content creators often get solicited to review products. And one of the most recurring requests that we get are lithium batteries. And I've done a couple of those videos, including this battery right here. This video is not about a specific brand or really a specific type of battery, but instead of doing more reviews on these batteries, what I really wanted to do was talk about how to determine how much battery you need in your RV. And spoiler alert, the lithium batteries, in my opinion, are the way to go. I'm a big believer in lithium batteries. We're going to talk a little bit about why that is. And these things are a lot cheaper than they were even just a few years ago. So there are a lot of lithium batteries out there that are really within, I think, everybody's price point. So again, today, we're not talking brands. We're not really talking about chemistry of the battery, although we're going to touch on it just a little bit. But what we're really going to talk about is the math, and we're going to help you determine how much battery you need in your RV for your specific lifestyle, and then you can decide on what type of battery you need for your own RV. So here's the deal. Most people don't need a NASA-style battery to enjoy a weekend off-grid, and most people don't need to spend $1,000 on one of those super fancy Battleborn batteries just to keep the lights on and the coffee brewing. What you really need is a battery setup that fits your RV lifestyle, not something that you see in somebody else's Instagram. So in this video, what we're going to do is we are going to look at how to figure out how much battery power you need to fit your RV lifestyle. And I'm just going to show you how to build a battery setup that works for you without draining your wallet. Now, just a quick note though, we are only going to talk about the batteries themselves and how much battery power you need. We're not going to talk about, solar power or inverter setups. We're not going to talk about anything like that. Now, obviously for sustainability, or if you want to be able to use some of those 120 volt AC components in your rig, you will need an inverter, you'll need the solar panels, all of that good stuff. But this video is really just focused on how big of a battery setup you need. And then if you want, you can take that information one step further and apply it to that solar setup that you're thinking about. So let's dive right into the battery basics. And we're going to talk about 3 different types of batteries. These are really the 3 big ones for the RV community. We're going to talk about flooded lead acid. We'll talk about the absorbent glass mat batteries, and then we'll talk about the lithium iron phosphate batteries. And we'll start here with the flooded lead acid batteries. These are kind of the OG of the RV batteries. These are the ones with the removable caps on top, and they got all of that fluid or electrolyte sloshing around on the inside. Now, the biggest drawback to the flooded lead acid batteries is you only really get about 50% of its rated capacity. So if that battery is rated at 100 amp hours, to prevent long-term damage to that battery and to maximize the performance of it long-term, you can really only discharge that thing about 50%. So that means out of a 100 amp hour battery, you're really only getting effectively 50 amp hours out of it. As far as maintenance go, yeah, there's not a lot, but it is super critical that you perform the required maintenance on these batteries. And really all it entails is taking those caps off of the top and verifying that there's enough electrolyte inside of that battery. And if there's not, well, you simply just add some DI water to it and you bring that level back up to where it should be. And again, that's not very complicated, but a lot of people tend to forget about that maintenance. And before you know it, especially in these warmer climates, that battery is essentially toast and it's no longer any good. That's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario is that you've just shortened the life of that battery. Now, these batteries are fairly reliable. Again, they're the OG of the batteries in the RV world, but they can be sensitive to temperature changes, and obviously those battery cells are not completely sealed up as you're driving down the road, so you got that vibration that can cause some of that electrolyte or that fluid inside of the battery to come out, which just increases the maintenance that you have to do on them. And finally, let's talk about the cost. These batteries are generally the cheapest ones you can find out there for your RV, at least as far as upfront cost goes, but they do have a shorter lifespan. So in the long run, the flooded lead acid batteries are probably not the most economical choice. Okay, let's move on to the absorbent glass matte batteries, or AGM batteries. You can think of these as the OG flooded lead acid batteries that have been to finishing school. They're sealed, they're spill proof, and they're just far less needy. And theoretically, you can get a little bit better depth of discharge out of the AGM batteries. You can technically discharge that thing up to about 80%, but it's still recommended that long term on these AGM batteries that you don't consistently discharge them past that 50%, because again, it's just going to shorten the lifespan of that battery. And then on the maintenance side of it, well, there is none. You get it installed and you can pretty much just forget about it, maybe go in there with a rag and dust it off every now and again, but that's about all there is to it. As for the reliability, they are pretty solid when you're driving down the road, right? Again, there's none of that fluid that's gonna leak out of the caps, so that's a bonus. And it's also better over a wide range of temperatures. As far as the cost goes, they're kind of the mid-range of the batteries. It's gonna cost a little bit more than a flooded lead acid battery, but it's probably gonna cost a little bit less than a lithium iron phosphate battery. And speaking of the lithium iron phosphate batteries, these are like that new kid in the neighborhood with the trust fund. They're lightweight, they're powerful, and they're built for long-term use. Now, the best thing about these lithium iron phosphate batteries is that you can actually discharge them all the way down to 100%. And just like the AGM batteries, maintenance on these things, again, is just pretty much getting out there every now and again and wipe it off with a rag, get all that dust and debris off of there. As for reliability, these things are super reliable. They're gonna last for a long time, in excess of 5,000 cycles on these batteries. So they may be a little bit more, but they're just going to last a lot longer. Additionally, they are safe in extreme temperatures, and the chemistry inside of these batteries themselves is also very safe. And then finally, the cost on these things. So Initially, it might be a little bit more than either the flooded, lead acid, or the AGM batteries, but again, they're gonna last much, much longer than either of those other two types of batteries. Now, not everybody needs this technology. Not everybody needs a lithium iron phosphate battery, and certainly not everybody needs to, again, drop $1,000 on that Battleborn battery if you're really just gonna be using it for things like staying the night in the Cracker Barrel parking lot. That's way overkill. And again, we're gonna get to how to select the type of battery that fits your RV lifestyle without breaking the bank. Because realistically, choosing a battery isn't about chasing the specs. It's about building a battery setup that fits the needs of your RV lifestyle. All right, so let's get to the meat of this video. But before we start talking about numbers and doing these calculations, we need to take care of the basics first. And what I mean by that is you need to make a list of all of the items in your RV that you want to be able to run on battery power during that boondocking trip or that overnight stay at Cracker Barrel, or even just that single travel day where you're going to be on battery only for 8 hours of driving. And I recommend that you make two separate lists. So number one is the list of items that you just absolutely cannot live without. And that second list will be just that list of things that are nice to have when you don't have shore power available. And what we're looking for here is how many watts or how many amps each of those items consumes. And then what we need to do is come up with an estimated daily usage, right? So most things in your RV are not going to be running continuously. So for example, if you're gonna run your living room lights in the evening, basically what we need to do is figure out how much power those lights draw and then kind of estimate how long they're going to be on throughout the course of a 24-hour period. Now, when you're making these lists and you're writing down how much power each item consumes, I prefer to use watts instead of amps. And that's really for a couple of different reasons. The first reason being that most things in your RV that you're going to want to run will probably list how many watts they draw, not necessarily how many amps they draw. And before we go any farther, let me just define a couple of terms real quick. So watts, what are watts? Watt is a representation of how much power a device is pulling at any given time. So for example, this TV, at any given time when it's on, it would be drawing 150 watts in that instant. And then we have watt hours, which is basically how much power a device uses over a given period of time. So this TV, for example, if it draws 150 watts and I watch it for 60 minutes, that's 150 watt hours of power that I've just consumed. If I double that, I watch it for 2 hours, now I've consumed 300 watt hours of power. So why do I prefer to use watts over amps during this power audit? Well, it's because amps only gives us part of the story. You've got to have the system voltage to make sense of all of it. Many of the items that you are going to want to use on that boondocking trip are going to be powered from the 120 volt AC system. And again, we're not talking about inverters or solar power here. We're strictly talking about battery capacity. But if you've got that inverter set up, you are going to be able to run 120 volt AC loads in your RV. And then of course you got all those 12 volt DC loads that you want to run, like your lights, maybe your 12 volt DC refrigerator, or even your furnace on those chilly nights. So what we've got is the 12 volt DC loads and we've got the 120 volt AC loads. So you have to come up with some common ground there. And so that common ground is to just simply use watts for everything. And then we can do a little bit of simple math to bring that all the way back to the battery. So what we're looking at here is just a simple equation of watts equals volts times amps. It really is that easy. Let's take a quick look at just a couple of examples here. So if you've got a 12 volt DC refrigerator that pulls 120 watts. That means that refrigerator is pulling 10 DC amps of power. Whereas if you've got a residential 120 volt AC refrigerator and it still pulls that 120 watts, now we're only looking at 1 amp of AC power to fire up that refrigerator. But remember, we're talking about batteries and we're talking about the DC system. We've got AC loads, we've got DC loads, and we just need that common ground again, which is the watts. But as you likely already know, battery capacity is typically listed in amp hours, which is what tells you how much power that battery can produce or supply in a given period of time. But since we are going to be working with watts and watt hours, we need to convert the amp hours that the battery is rated at into watt hours. And that's a pretty simple calculation. And this equation is very similar to the one we just looked at, but instead of just talking about watts, now we're talking about watt hours. Watt hours are simply the product of the system voltage and the amp hours that are being pulled from that battery. So if we've got a 100 amp hour battery at 12 volts, that means that that battery can provide or supply 1200 watt hours of power. That is your usable energy, kind of. Because remember, if you've got a lead acid battery, you can really only use about 50% of that before you need to stop discharging it and recharge it. So when we're looking at the flooded lead acid batteries and even the AGM batteries, that 1200 watt hours quickly turns into only about 600 watt hours, whereas when we're looking at the lithium batteries, we have that full range of discharge on that battery. We can discharge it all the way down to 0%. So we've got that full 1200 watt hours of power available from those lithium iron phosphate batteries. All right, one more thing to consider before we get to this power audit process, and that is how much peak power you need to be able to deliver at any given time. Some loads in your RV are going to draw a very significant amount of power when it first starts up. Things like your air conditioner, and if you've got a 120 volt AC residential refrigerator, when the compressors start up on those things, they draw a very significant amount of power, and we need to make sure that our battery can handle that much power at once. So once you've built the list of all of those items that you want to run when you're on only battery power, you need to take a look at two things. You need to identify that one item that draws the most amps at any given time, and then you need to look at your battery's maximum discharge rate. And that can be in either amps or watts. It doesn't really matter. We just need to identify that peak surge or that biggest amount of power that's going to be drawn and compare that to what the battery is able to produce. All right, so again, what we're going to do here is we are going to figure out all of the items that you want to use in your RV. We want to figure out how much power they draw, and then we want to figure out how long you want to use those things during the course of a 24-hour period. And then we'll take those numbers and figure out how to size your battery bank to fit your needs. We're not going to base it on guesses. We're not going to base it on the marketing hype, and we're definitely not going to base it off of whatever your neighbors have. So remember I said earlier that I like to make two separate lists. We like to make a list of the essential items that you just can't live without, and then all of those things that are just more like creature comforts. So let's start with those essentials, the things like the water pump, the lights, and that refrigerator. And then we'll move on to those creature comforts, things like the TV, the phone charger, and maybe a laptop. And then once we've got all those things identified and how much power they draw, it's just a matter of doing some simple math to figure out how much battery power you actually need. All right, the easiest way to do this, especially when you're just getting started, is just go around and look at all those things that you want to use. Now, like I said before, most things are going to list how many watts they draw, but some items don't. Some things will only list how many amps they draw. But again, we can just use some easy math to convert those amps over to watts. So on your list, if that item lists how many watts it draws, just write that number down. If it lists how many amps, then we need to go back to our equation, watts equals volts times amps, to determine how many watts it actually draws. So for example, if an item draws 5 amps and it's powered by your 12 volt DC system, then that 5 amps times the 12 volts is 60 watts. And for those 120 volt AC powered items, we do the same exact calculation. So for example, if your refrigerator draws 3 amps and it's on 120 volts, that's 360 watts of power that refrigerator is consuming. Now there are going to be some items in your rig that either may not have a sticker on them telling you how much power they draw, or you just can't access that sticker. So let's just look at the ceiling lights, for example. I've never really actually paid attention to the back of those lights to see if there's a sticker on there saying how much power it draws, but I do know this. Those things can be a little bit tricky to pull out of the ceiling, and it's just not worth it. So for things like that, I just like to do a simple Google search. So if you just get on the Google machine and you type in there, how much power does an RV LED light draw? It's gonna tell you that they draw anywhere from about 3 to 12 watts. Now, I like to just take the middle road on that, just kind of take the average. So we're gonna go with about 8 watts per LED light that's hanging out of your ceiling. And then all you have to do is multiply that 8 watts times the number of lights that are on that string, and you'll have the total number of watts that your lighting system provides. Now that you've got that list made up of all of the items that you want to run while you're boondocking, and you've listed out how much power each one of those items draws, now what we have to do is estimate how much total time in a 24-hour period that those loads are going to run. So for example, if your water pump draws 100 watts and you use it for a total of 15 minutes throughout a 24-hour period, then we're going to take that 100 watts and we're going to multiply it by 0.25, because that's a quarter of an hour, and we see that that water pump is going to draw a total of 25 watt hours throughout the course of the day. And we want to do that same thing for each individual item that you're going to use in your RV, and then add up all those numbers for the total. And what we're looking at here is just an example of what this should look like, or what this could look like. I did it in a table format here, but basically what I've got is all the loads that I want to run. I've got how much power each one draws, how long it's going to run during the day, and then the total watt hours that are used overall. So using this example, you can see that we would need to provide a little over 3,700 watt hours for every 24-hour period that we're out there boondocking. And remember that a 12-volt 100-amp-hour battery can produce or provide about 1,200 watt hours of power. So we take that 3714, divide it by that 1,200 watt hours that our battery can supply, and that gives us 3.1 batteries. Well, obviously we can't have 3.1 batteries. So what I would do in this case is just obviously round that up to 4 batteries. So number one, that's gonna make sure that you can provide that total 3,700 watt hours, and it gives us a little bit of room for error. But remember, lead acid batteries, we can only discharge them down to about 50%. So that means if we're talking about lead acid batteries, we've got to take that 4 batteries that we need, and we need to double it for a total of 8 batteries. Now, if we're talking about the lithium batteries, we know we can discharge those all the way down to 0%. So that means ultimately that we only need those 4 batteries. All right, now granted, this particular example is probably one that's fairly accurate for somebody that may be a serious boondocker who's got a significant solar setup. But for the average overnight stay at a Cracker Barrel, this is probably overkill, but the concept and the math all remains the same. Now, there are other ways, other methods to do this power audit to determine, how much total power you use in your RV. But the one we're going over right now is probably the easiest way to do it for beginners. If you want to check out different ways to do this power audit, I'll put a link to another video that I did previously that was titled something like, how much solar power do I actually need in my RV? Now, that video goes into a little bit more detail pretty much on everything that we're talking about today. So it's a little bit more in-depth, and it also talks about, how many solar panels do we need, how big of a generator you might need, all of that kind of stuff. But for this video, again, we're only talking about our battery needs. All right, next let's talk about some common mistakes to avoid when you're building that battery setup. So number one is undersized batteries for the peak power that you're going to need for things like the air conditioner and the refrigerator, if those are things that you want to run while you're boondocking. We've already talked about that one. Second, don't overlook that inverter draw if you have an inverter and all of those parasitic loads that you have in your RV. Now again, we're not talking about inverters in depth in this video, but what you need to realize is that in that process of taking DC power and converting it to AC power, that inverter actually consumes some amount of power in that process. So you need to take that into account. And then again, you have parasitic loads like radios and carbon monoxide detectors that are going to be consuming some amount of load all the time, and there's nothing you can do about it aside from unplugging them. Now, I don't recommend unplugging your carbon monoxide detectors, but those parasitic loads draw power all the time, and again, you need to account for that. And I would say that whatever your final number is on your power audit, whatever that total number of watt hours is, I would say add another 20% to that to account for that inverter load and those parasitic loads. Another common mistake that people make is forgetting about how temperature, the outside temperature, affects the performance of the battery. Lead acid batteries are going to have a significantly higher reduction in performance at temperatures below freezing, anywhere from 20% or more reduction in capacity. Lithium batteries aren't perfect, but they have a much better performance in those colder, below freezing temperatures. And then the last thing I want to talk about is mixing new and old batteries. Mixing new and old batteries can have a negative effect on the overall capacity of your battery setup. It can cause those new batteries to degrade faster than they should, and overall it's just a general safety concern. All right, let's move on to looking at some real world battery sizing examples. But before we get to that, I just want to make a note here that in all of these examples, I just assume that we're using 100 amp hour batteries. Now, certainly battery manufacturers make batteries that are larger than that. You can get them in 200, 300, 400 amp hours. But for our examples here, we're just going to assume that we're using 100 amp hour batteries. All right, so the first scenario here is just a weekend warrior and you're gonna go out and boondock for 2 days off grid. All right, our use case here is gonna be that we're using lights, we're using a water pump, we're gonna use maybe a couple of overhead fans, we're gonna have our parasitic loads like our CO detectors running, and then just other basic DC loads. Next, we're gonna assume that from our power audit, we determined that our daily usage is going to be about 1,200 watt hours, or 100 amp hours. So that means that 2 days of autonomy, or being able to operate off grid, you're gonna consume about 2,400 watt hours total. So that means for AGM or flooded lead acid batteries, where you have that 50% usable capacity, you're gonna need about 4,800 watt hours of total capacity, which means you're gonna end up needing 4 100 amp hour AGM or flooded lead acid batteries. And then for lithium batteries, you're only gonna need 2 because again, you can draw those all the way down to 0%. And then for our second scenario, we're just gonna look at a typical travel day where you're really just using the basics in your RV, plus maybe that 12-volt refrigerator. So in this case, we're gonna say we are running the fridge on DC. We've got those safety systems online, like our carbon monoxide detectors, and then we've got the occasional lighting, and then maybe you wanna run one of your exhaust fans going down the road. So in this case, we're gonna assume that our power audit tells us we're going to consume about 900 watt hours through the course of that travel day. Okay, for the AGM and the flooded lead acid batteries, we're going to need 2 of them, again, because we can only discharge down to 50%. And then for a lithium battery, again, we only need 1 single battery. All right, now let's talk about money, because nobody out there wants to spend more on a battery than they paid for their Brooklyn bedding mattress. All right, for our flooded lead acid batteries, we're gonna be looking at anywhere from about $100 to $300. For the AGM, we're looking somewhere between about $200 and $500. And then for the lithium iron phosphate, we're looking at anywhere from $150 to kind of the basic lithium iron phosphate battery, all the way up to $1,500 plus, because of the technology that comes along with those batteries. But remember, even though those flooded lead acid and those AGM batteries initially have a lower upfront cost, you're gonna have to buy twice as many as compared to the lithium iron phosphate. So that's obviously going to drive up the price of your entire battery setup. Now, as I alluded to in the beginning of this video, I'm a huge proponent of the lithium iron phosphate batteries. I think as far as the RV world goes, this should really just be the standard because you get so much more usable capacity out of them, and they have a lot of features in them that just make them much safer to use in this environment. So I want to go a little bit more in depth into the cost of these lithium iron phosphate batteries because there's a wide range of those batteries available on the market out there. So let's take a look first at the budget lithium iron phosphate batteries, and then we'll work our way up to the mid-range and the super expensive ones. And again, like I said in the beginning of this video, the cost of these batteries has come down significantly in the past few years, and you can pick up these budget-friendly batteries anywhere from about $150 to $300 per 100 amp hours. And these are going to give you the true lithium perks. They're lightweight, they're deep discharge, and they have long life cycles without emptying your wallet. And so let's just take a look at the pros and cons of the budget batteries and what their best use case scenario is. All right, for that $150 to $300, you're going to get a 100 amp hour battery with a built-in battery monitoring system that gives you some basic protection. And these batteries are going to be good for about 2,000 to maybe 4,000 cycles or so. All right, the cons for these are they typically are going to have shorter warranties, probably somewhere between about 1 to 3 years, and then it's going to have limited low temperature charging, and it's going to have probably the most basic cell quality out there for the lithium iron phosphate batteries. Now, having said that, these batteries are still going to outperform and outlast the overwhelming majority of your lead acid batteries out there. And then these batteries are really for the weekend warriors, those casual boondockers, and maybe those that are looking to just simply upgrade from maybe an AGM battery to this lithium iron phosphate technology. Now let's take a look at the mid-range batteries, which are going to run you probably anywhere between about $300 to $600. So the pros here is it's going to have stronger BMS protection. They're going to come with longer warranties. Typically, when you get up into that level, you're looking at about a 5-year warranty. You're going to have a consistent cycle life. Most of them are going to have some kind of Bluetooth or Wi-Fi monitoring function, which in my opinion is a must-have for these lithium iron phosphate batteries, because why would you not want to see exactly what is going on with that battery when you're using it? And then the only real con to these batteries is they are going to be a little bit more expensive. But with that extra money, you're going to get better protection from the BMS, and it's, again, just going to last longer. And then these batteries are really going to be best for those of us who frequently boondock, have moderate solar arrays, or we want just a little bit extra peace of mind. And finally, let's talk about these high-end lithium iron phosphate batteries. Now, these things can run you anywhere from about $600 to $1,500 plus. These things are not cheap, and they're going to have the top tier chemistry in them for all your electronics and for the most demanding systems. So the pros on these, right, they're going to have premium cells in them, and you're going to get 5,000 plus cycles out of them, probably closer to 10,000 cycles out of them. You're going to have an advanced BMS. You're going to get that full monitoring suite via either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, and they're typically going to come, again, with a longer warranty, somewhere between about 7 to 10 years. So obviously the con here is that they are super expensive, and they're total overkill for moderate use. They're really designed for those power solar users who are out there and they want to get off grid for extended periods of time. Now, here's my take and my opinion on this is that most RVers out there do not need these super high priced lithium iron phosphate batteries unless you're building some kind of large complex solar setup that's going to get you off grid, like I said, for extended periods of time. But for most of us, those budget or even those mid-range lithium iron phosphate batteries, or even a good solid AGM battery, are going to provide more than enough power and functionality for those limited boondocking trips that we make. All right, so let's wrap all of this up with some key takeaway points. So first, battery type matters. Flooded AGM and lithium batteries each have different usable capacities and maintenance needs. You want to calculate your daily amp hour usage based on real world loads, not guesses. You want to factor in autonomy, meaning how many days you want to run without recharging. And then you want to pad your numbers a little bit for those parasitic loads, inverter overhead, if applicable, and environmental losses. And then you want to match your battery bank to your specific lifestyle, whether it's weekend camping, travel days, or moderate boondocking. And because we've just been talking about batteries, for the most part, we're not talking about generators, solar, or inverters. I do want to make a quick note on sustainability. So obviously, if you want to get out there and boondock for longer periods of time, you're going to want to pair those batteries with some sort of sustainable charging source. So whether that's the solar panels on the roof or whether that's carrying a small generator around with you, the thing to keep in mind is obviously these batteries are only going to last for a limited amount of time before they're dead and they need to be recharged. And again, if you want to go a little bit more in depth on this, or you want to start talking now about how much solar power you need, how big of an inverter or generator you need, again, check out that video that I previously did about how much solar power do I really need in my RV. And then as a bonus, I'll throw a link down in the description area for a video I did about alternatives to the traditional solar power setup in an RV. And I'm talking about portable power stations. So if you're interested in learning a little bit about those, check that video out down below as well. All right, so if you've got questions about your own setup, or maybe you just want a little bit of help walking through this whole process of doing a power audit and figuring out how much battery power you need, drop a comment down below. We read and respond to each and every comment that we get. So if you got questions, just drop them down below. And then additionally, if you found this video helpful, hey, make sure you give us a thumbs up down there. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and then make sure you hit that bell button down there as well to get notified of all of our future videos. And until that future video, happy camping and stay safe out there, guys.